this year. I haven't been sick the entire year. I was sick on 2 different occasions. And as I was ironing my suit today, I felt something in my pocket, and I pulled it out, and it was my symposium ID from this conference last year. So I'm sick again, and I'm wearing the same exact suit that I wore last year. So to all you fashionistas out there, I apologize. So who am I? So Anthony says, right, I could introduce myself. Now, I normally go backwards when I speak, right? I kind of tell you what I do now and then tell you what I used to do, but giving the audience, I think I'm going to start in my past life, right? So what I used to be the GIS specialist for the Newark, New Jersey Police Department. During my time there, most importantly, I reported to the greatest chief of staff in the history of policing. And also what I did is I handled all of the day-to-day crime analysis, crime mapping, program evaluation activities of the agency. I did that for a period of 6 years. After finishing my PhD at Rutgers University, I decided it was time to no longer be a city government employee, and I had the fortune of, kind of wrapping up when John Jay College of Criminal Justice was hiring. Currently an associate professor over there in my 7th year. So essentially, I like to explain my academic work as kind of an extension of the work I used to do as a police analyst. I kind of recognized quickly that, my passion for crime analysis was something I could actually still do as an academic, and a lot of my research revolves around partnerships with police, problem identification, designing, implementing, and evaluating place-based policing strategies, and the such. Over the last 18 months or so as well, I've had the privilege of partnering with DCJS on training crime analysts in the new ArcGIS Pro software. So we thought that the symposium would be a good opportunity to kind of marry those two things, right, to give me a chance to come over here and in the sake of advancing evidence-based practice, talk about place-based policing, talk about hotspots, why they're important, and then also for the active crime analyst in the room to just go through some of the new features available in ArcGIS Pro to help you identify hotspots for hotspots policing strategies. Now, I always like to say that hotspots and hotspots policing, it's one of the rare developments that has both practical appeal and also a high level of theoretical support, right? The last 30 years of criminological research points to a focus on micro-level places and a focus on hotspots as an effective and a worthwhile policing strategy. So essentially, a lot of the developments from the environmental criminology perspective help us make sense of why crime concentrates, right? So essentially, crime is the outcome of a pretty simple, conceptually speaking, simple formula in which motivated offenders and likely targets, or vulnerable targets rather, converge in time and space in the absence of a capable guardian. Now, when we speak about this, we tend to get caught up on the human behaviors part of that, right? The motivated offender and the victim part, right? The routine activities of people who commit and are victimized by crime. What often gets lost in the discussion is that the environment actually determines a large part whether or not that equation comes to fruition, right? Not every interaction, not every convergence of target and offender results in a crime. A lot of the times it's the context of a place that determines what type of opportunities are available to a given offender, and also what level of guardianship is possible within an area. So essentially, we could consider this problem analysis triangle and the convergence of victims and offenders as revolving around typical behavior patterns of everyday human behavior, right? So essentially, we can consider all of our regular activities as involving 3 types of places. We have nodes, we have edges, and we have paths. Excuse me for peeking over my shoulder. Often my speaking notes are all the way over there, and my glasses aren't quite strong enough for me to see it. So essentially, nodes are any places in the environment where we spend considerable amount of time, right? The egg, or whatever this building is officially called, right? This is a node. We all came here to attend a symposium today. Pathways are how we get between nodes. Some of us walked, some of us Ubered, some of us took public transit, some of us drove. Edges are boundaries of different types of areas that converge on one another, right? So edges can be concrete physical obstructions, right? So if you have a railroad running through the middle of a neighborhood, the railroad essentially represents an edge between two different areas. Edges can also be more sociological in nature. For example, the area immediately around John Jay College, you would identify that as a traditional college area, lots of little coffee shops, a lot of students stressed out in those coffee shops, cramming for midterms and final exams. Once you hit a block over, it becomes more of a bar district, right? So essentially, the edge between those two areas represents where those two different environments butt up against each other. Now, being an activity space, being a node, being a path, being an edgeway does not automatically lead to crime, right? It's when a node, path, or edgeway is one or two types of environments where it can be criminogenic. There's plenty of people at the egg. What is this building officially called? The egg? Officially. All right, the Plaza Convention Center has plenty of people, right, in it today. This is a high-activity node, but I haven't noticed any crime problems, right? I'm not a sworn law enforcement officer, so maybe I'm missing something out there, right? But this does not seem to be a criminogenic environment to me, right? That's because the type of behavior that's promoted at this area is not criminogenic in nature. So our activity spaces are possible generators of hotspots when it falls into one or two different categories, right? First, we have crime attractors, which are places that afford many criminal opportunities that are well known. Open-air drug markets, prostitution strolls are probably the best examples. We also have crime generators, which are places that are not inherently criminogenic, but afford opportunities for crime nonetheless. So a good example of that are places like bars, drinking establishments. Nothing illegal about going to a bar, but in a lot of bars, people drink a little too much, do stupid things, and creates the opportunities for violence. Nobody in this room can be classified according to that. So what's the implications of this, right? So the implications of considering space in this way is that crime generators and attractors are not going to be evenly distributed throughout the environment, right? Drug markets are not evenly placed throughout a jurisdiction. Bars are not evenly placed throughout a jurisdiction. These types of environments cluster in tight places. So what that means is also that opportunities for crime are going to cluster in very small micro places. This also kind of reconfigures the notion of what we should consider as place in policing. All right, so essentially, how are policing services traditionally organized, right? Policing has been place-based forever, arguably, right? However, the places that have traditionally organized police services are rather large areas, police precincts, police sectors, so on, right? However, if we think about what I've been talking about and thinking about what the environmental criminology tells us, that may be too large of a unit to consider crime and to consider police deployment, right? If opportunities for crime concentrate, and that means crime concentrates, then we need to get on a smaller level in order to make sure that our crime prevention resources concentrate. And that's emerged, what has emerged from that line of thinking is this conception of small places as targets for police intervention. So to the left, you see a street segment, which was the target area units for the Minneapolis hotspots policing experiments. Again, very small area, much smaller than a precinct or a sector. To the right, we have a cluster of street segments that was used as the target areas for the Jersey City displacement experiment. Again, a little larger than a street segment, but much smaller. So to kind of point to why that's helpful from a crime analysis and also from a police response perspective, what we have here is we have a map of robbery in the Boogie Down Bronx, New York, right? Aggregated up to census tracts. Thank you for the laugh. You're the only one who laughed. I thought I'd get a bigger response out of that one. I've wanted to be a stand-up comic my whole life. Robberies aggregated up to large units, right? Red areas are the hotspots, right? The red areas are the areas that have the most crime, right? So if you're using this for deployment purposes, you're going to target one of the big, scary-looking red areas, right? But if we zoom in to one of them, we'll see that the individual streets that comprise that larger area, right, most of them actually are absent crime, right? Most of the streets within what we would mistakenly designate as a hotspot actually don't experience any crime on them. Much fewer individual streets comprise the problem, right? So again, I think that's a good illustration of why it's important to think small when you're doing your crime analysis and to think small when you're thinking about proactive police deployment. And very quickly, I'll go through some past research, right? This isn't just an illustration from my quick and dirty maps of the Bronx, right? We have 30 years of crime and place research to support this, right? The original hotspots experiment, or hotspot study rather, found that in Minneapolis, over 50% of citizen calls for service, crime-related calls for service, occurred at only 3% of addresses, right? And when we break that down and look at individual crime types, it's even more concentrated. You see that only 1% of addresses accounted for about 50% of all rapes. Only 2% of addresses accounted for about 50% of robberies. And that relationship holds regardless what city we look at, and also holds regardless how long of a period we look at. Again, the Seattle experiment, we have about 50% of crime is accounted for every year over a 14-year period by about 5% of small micro street segments. Over 30 years in Boston, again, same thing. Every year over the 30-year period, about 2 to 3% of individual street segments account for over 50% of the robbery events. All of that brings us to ArcGIS Pro. Well, I'm making good on time, so I'm going to have a sip of my tea. I am. All right. All of which brings us to ArcGIS Pro. So this is where I have to sneak up here and look at. So essentially, I assume everyone in here, at least the active crime analysts, have used Esri products, right? So how many people have switched over to Pro like full time? All right, not full time. All right, so I saw a sprinkling. So everyone at least has a working knowledge of it, or not really? Kind of. All right, so I'll kind of go a little quickly. Say that again. You're going to give us. Oh yeah, that's why I'm here, I guess. Big pressure. I thought I was just here to tell jokes and talk about my wardrobe. All right, so ArcGIS Pro. So essentially, right, what I've been hearing recently, and Chris Delaney actually made a similar observation last time I spoke to him, is that I'm seeing a tendency for people to refer to ArcGIS Pro as the online version and for the ArcGIS as the desktop version. Now, technically, that's not true, right? Technically speaking, ArcGIS Online is ArcGIS Desktop, right? This is a software that sits on your desktop just like your current version of ArcGIS does, right? The difference is that whereas the old version of ArcGIS had these standalone separate programs such as ArcMap, ArcScene, ArcCatalog, all of that functionality is now wrapped up into a single software package in ArcPro, right? And as part of ArcPro, you need an active user accounts on ArcGIS Online to connect to some kind of external portal, right? So I think that's where the confusion about online GIS comes in, right? It's not an online software. You need to be able to connect to an online account, but it is a desktop standalone software. All right, now, what we're looking at here is a quick screen grab of what the ArcGIS Pro interface looks like. So for those of you familiar with the prior version of ArcGIS, right, this looks a little bit different, right? So rather than having everything available to you through drop-downs, what you see here is ArcGIS Pro gives you everything in windows and panes, and in addition, tabs within the ribbons, right? So essentially, we're moving away from drop-downs and moving towards an interface that looks more like, Microsoft Word or a lot of Microsoft products. And it's also interactive, right? So essentially, you don't see all of the ribbons all at a time, right? The software is able to tell what you want to accomplish depending on what you're clicking on, and those are the ribbons that you can see. Disclaimer, right? For those of you switching over, for those of you migrating from ArcGIS to Pro, the biggest frustration, right, is going to be dealing with this new interface, right? I'm not sure if Chris Delaney is in here or not. If he is, I hope he forgives this next statement. Right, that's why I kind of hated Pro, right, when I first started working in it. right? Little dumb things like, where's this tool that used to be right here? I'm clicking around and I'm Googling and all of this nonsense, right? And half hour later, I finally find what I'm able to do. It's all right, right? Once you get over that hurdle, right, I promise you that it's worth the transition over to the software, right? Once you get over the hurdle of things being in different areas, once you get over the hurdle of like right-clicking and not doing everything it used to do, it's an extremely powerful software that's very beneficial for the crime analysis community. And essentially what won me over, right, was the crime analysis toolbar, right? So you see the tab up on top for crime analysis. That brings us over to the crime analysis toolbar. So essentially the crime analysis toolbar is a collection of pre-existing and newly created tools that are organized around the crime analysis function. Right, so essentially, you see to the left, we have data management, right? The data management area helps you manage and clean your data as it suggests. Selection, but we'll be focusing on today, given the topic, is this tactical and strategic analysis tool set, right? So you see here, we have a number of tools at your disposal, right? We won't go over all of these during the question and answer. If anybody was curious about what some of these other ones that we don't cover do, we could talk about that. But what we'll be focusing on today are all of the different ways you could go about creating hotspots or conceptualizing hotspots within the mapping software. So out of the gate, right, the one tool that's always been available in the ArcGIS platform is the kernel density tool. Now, as working crime analyst, pretty confident that everyone's familiar with this. So the only thing I wanted to point out is this notion of the size of your search radius in cell, right? As far as I can tell, there's not too much of a firm standard about how to go about setting the parameters for your hotspot maps, right? So essentially, you have to do two things to create a density map, right? You have to identify a cell size, and then you have to identify a search radius that the computer is going to use to identify or define rather close, right? If you're saying you want to see points that are clustered together, you need to define a distance that defines close, right? 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet, 3,000 feet, how close together do points have to be considered part of the same hotspot? Now, the advice I give, right, in working with the police agencies that I've been working with, and, in a number of my research projects, the advice I give is I'm a firm believer that your search radius and cell size, but more importantly, search radius, should be some kind of byproduct of the actual geography of your city, right? So essentially, whatever the average block size is in your city, that's what I would use to set your radius. For example, we'll use very easy numbers here. Let's say that the average block size in your city is 500 feet long, and you need to create a hotspot map to identify target areas for foot patrol, and your operations division is of the opinion that one foot patrol officer can cover about 2 blocks effectively. Then an appropriate search radius would be 1,000 feet, right? Because again, it takes all of the pieces of information that you need to operationalize, and it creates the map based on that, right? 500 feet, 2 blocks, search radius of 1,000, right? Again, you could kind of play around with that depending on the purpose of your analysis, but again, I'm a believer that the search radius or cell size should have some kind of reflection of the actual geography and need for your analysis. All right, and actually, I forgot to shout out the Rochester Police Department quickly. So all of the data I used here, I was able to obtain from ArcGIS Online, which is an online platform. The Rochester Police Department has publicly shared some very rich data sets that I was able, represent. Some very rich data sets that I was able to download and put this presentation together with. Right? I wanted something New York State-esque, right? I didn't want everything to be from New York City, and Rochester came through. All right, so essentially what we're looking at here, right, we're looking at gun robbery density for 2016 in the city of Rochester, right? Again, nothing new. This is kind of standard hotspot technique that you could do in any version of Arc. Right? Now, the difference here, one of the new tools that I wanted to go over is now you have the ability through the crime analysis toolbar to actually identify and measure how hotspots change over time, right? Technically, you could do this in previous versions, but it was literally about a 5 or 6 step process. But now, with the click of a button, you're able to tell whether or not and to what level your hotspots change over time. So as an example, we're looking at 2016. We fast forward to 2017. And just by eyeballing it, yeah, we can see that the hotspots have moved a bit, right? We could see that the high crime areas in year 1 are not the same high crime areas in year 2. But if we wanted to more directly quantify that, if we wanted to more directly measure that, we could go back to the crime analysis toolbar and select the density change option. All right, so as the name suggests, the density change tool tells you to what level the density has changed from time 1 to time 2. All you have to do, right, within a single pop-up pane, you put in the hotspot map you made for year 1, put in the hotspot map you made for year 2, and then like magic but better, it pops up like this, right? So essentially you see here that we're able to not just eyeball it, but actually identify and classify all areas of Rochester based upon whether or not the gun robbery hotspot density increased or decreased over time. And also, and this is kind of a cool little change in ArcGIS Pro, another thing that won me over, is the legend, right, the way that the hotspot maps are classified actually automatically gets generated for you, right? So the smart thing about ArcGIS Pro is it understands what's needed in certain tools, and it'll automatically classify, so you don't have to waste time symbolizing, going in, creating different categories. It does it for you. So you see here, right, we don't have to guess. We have, specific measures of whether or not density reduced over time. Those are the dark blue areas. Or whether or not density increased over time. Those are the dark red areas. And the next question, right, is probably, all right, can you show me, crime analyst, can you show me, a list of all of the robberies that happened in our problematic areas, so the areas where robbery density has increased, we'd like to identify the specific points. So again, using this map, you could easily isolate the specific points that you're interested in and, subject those cases to further analysis, right? And also easily share that with operations, detectives, or whoever else needs the information. Okay. All right, so that's raster mapping, right? Now, the next technique I wanted to go over was the optimized hotspots tool. So essentially, the optimized hotspots tool, and this is where I have to keep my notes again, my apologies. So essentially, this tool builds upon traditional raster mapping in a couple of ways, right? The first way is, and to not go too far down a GIS rabbit hole here, but rather than using raster mapping, right, the optimized hotspot tool uses vector mapping. So rather than a raster file, what you'll have is an actual polygon layer that you could interact with your other data. I'm trying to not lose everybody by going into the details. I'll save the rest for Q&A. If anybody wants to know more about the difference between raster and vector, we could talk about it. So that's the first difference. The second difference is it adds in, and since it's a polygon and not a raster, it adds in some key information within the attribute table of the hotspot maps, right? So all grids in your jurisdiction, when using this tool, get a Z-score, right? And we'll discuss what that means in a little bit, and also gets a significance level. So what that does, using nearest neighbor statistics and also false discovery statistics, what this tells you is not just where does crime concentrate, but it allows you to identify the significance level, right? So essentially what this tool tries to do is to avoid false positive detections, right? Avoid detecting clusters that are not, statistically speaking, real significant hotspots, right? Now, this is one of these tools that you have to get the hang of, right? There's a lot of options that you have to select when running this. There's probably going to be some kind of trial and error, right, before you figure out the exact parameters that give you the type of analytical product you want. The first decision you have to make is you have to decide what type of grid do you want to create to measure the hotspots, right? So essentially, just like a normal raster, we have to convert the study area to a grid. of equally sized cells, or there's another option I'll go over in a second. Those equally sized areas, we aggregate the points to, and then we apply the spatial statistics to those areas. So the default is just creating just what's referred to as a basic fishnet grid. And this directly mimics, a traditional raster hotspot map. We're breaking up our study area into a bunch of different squares, and then we're going to add up all of the points in the squares, assign a weight to them, and then do our spatial statistics, right? Now, the hardcore geographers out there, right, recommend not doing this, right? Why do they recommend not doing this? Because the problem with equal-sized squares, right, is that areas towards the corner of the squares are actually further away from the center than areas on the side, right? This laser pointer isn't working, but it's not a pointer. Well, that's a tease. Right, but everyone could see, right, and everyone understands basic geometry here, right? So again, the squares are not uniform, right? So essentially, they're not a uniform distance from the center. Why does that matter? It matters, you know, the hardcore geographers tell you that matters is because when you're running your nearest neighbor statistics, right, the math assumes that every point within a given boundary has the same distance to the center, right? Again, the statistics kind of just make that assumption in the calculations. So what some of the hardcore geographers recommend is moving away from fishnets and using a hexagon grid, right? So essentially, you see what we have here. We have the same concept. We've converted our study area to a grid of equally sized units, but instead of squares, we're using hexagons. And the problem this addresses is, again, now areas in the corners are about the same distance to the center as areas right on the side. I mean, practical terms is probably not that big of a deal. The hotspot maps I've made with one or the other don't look drastically different, but just know, you know, perhaps with the data you're working with, maybe it will be a big deal. But just wanted to point out those two options that you have. All right, so here's the result, right? So at first, this looks like a regular hotspot map, right? But you'll notice that we have some differences. Again, automatically creates the symbology for you, right? So you don't have to worry about doing that manually. And what we have here, right, is you see the red areas, those are the statistically significant hotspots, right? So those are the areas where points are clustered tightly, and it's not due just to statistical chance, but it also tells you areas that are statistically cold, right? So essentially, it tells you what these significant cold spots are, right? So that's the first difference, but in my opinion, the real kind of benefit comes in the data that's provided in the attribute table. All right, so what we have here is we have a screenshot of the attribute table that's supporting that visual map. And you see here we have a number of pieces of information that can be helpful as we move forward with analysis. So first, every individual grid or hexagon, whatever you decide, gets a z-score assigned to it. Right? So essentially, the higher a z-score, the more concentrated crime is considered within that unit. Right? So the higher the z-score, to kind of pointing back to raster mapping, the higher the density level. Right? So the more dense crime is in the area of that cell or hexagon. Also gets a significance level, right? It gets a p-value, right? So statistically speaking, right, anything below the threshold of 0.05 is what we refer to as statistically significant. So you could use that column to identify the areas where, again, you have a significant hotspot. The other benefit of having this in an attribute table and not a raster file that is not supported by an attribute table is you can actually select subsets of your hotspots, right? For example, let's say that, you know, chief of police sticks his or her head into your office and says, hey, we have enough foot patrol officers to police 30 street corners, right? Need you to tell me what 30 street corners in the city we need to put these cops at. You could just highlight the 30 grids or 30 hexagons that have the highest Z values, right? And there you go, right? And now you have actual actionable information on the map that you could provide to to parties that need it, right? Again, you can't do that with a raster map, right? You can't select individual cells easily, right? You can't do that easily within a traditional raster map. All right, so lastly, right, so my last few slides here, wanted to kind of harken back to our original discussion about micro units and street segments and the importance of understanding crime on these types of micro units, right? Because up until now, all of the hotspot identification tools that we identified produce, kind of for lack of a better term, kind of abstract target areas, right? A hexagon over your study grid is not like a real place, right? There is no hexagon out in the street. A raster cell, a density map, right? It's not like an actual real place, right? I mean, it's an abstraction of where the crime clusters, right? Which is fine, right? But sometimes it might be more beneficial to actually measure crime at real units, right? So what we're going to do here is we're going to use another tool in the crime analysis toolbar that isn't necessarily a hotspots tool, but we're going to use it to operationalize and identify hotspots in Rochester. So essentially, right here, tactical strategic analysis, the incident count tool. Now, what this does essentially is this tool automates spatial joins, right? So previously, where you have to right-click on a layer, go down to spatial join, add in whatever points you wanted to join to the layer, the incident tool now automates all of that within the click of one button, right? So essentially, doing an incident tool, we're going to merge our gun robbery incidents to street segments. Now, what happens there is the result is in our attribute table, right? Just like a normal spatial join, we have a new field that identifies the number of points that fall within each street segment, right? Now, another cool thing about Arc Pro is that the chart functionality is really good, right? Now, we've always been able to make charts in ArcGIS. To be perfectly honest, I never really would because I didn't think they were very good. Keep an eye out for the Esri folk here to see. All right, good. All right. Yeah, no, the charts are just never good, right? So I would just tell people, make your charts in Excel or something like that. It's not worth the time to do them in actual Arc. The chart functionality in Pro is actually pretty beneficial, and I recommend everyone take a look at it. So essentially, in whatever column you wanted to make a chart for, it's just right-clicking and then going into the newly designed statistics function in Arc Pro. All right, so what we have here, right, let me quickly kind of walk you through what we're looking at. So what we have here is we have a quick little bar graph that shows us the distribution of the join count column, and again, that's our number of gun robberies on all of the streets within Rochester, right? Now, in identifying hotspots, right, we're not interested in all streets, right, because those numbers are always going to be kind of statistically skewed since there's so many streets and crime happens fairly infrequently, right? You never have as many crimes as streets. At least you hope not, at least not violent crime like robbery, gun robberies. We're not interested in all streets. We're only interested in the streets that experience some kind of criminal activity, right? So what you're able to do in charts, you'll notice that what I did on the bottom is I was able to highlight all of the numbers greater than 0, right? So essentially, I highlighted all of the streets that experienced one or more robbery. Now, what that enables us to do is to create a brand new chart that only includes the highlighted streets, right? So essentially, what we have here is we have the similar bar graph, but only taking into consideration the streets that have experienced a gun robbery. Okay? So what we have here is now you see that for those streets that experienced a gun robbery, the average number was 2 and the standard deviation was 3. Now, I won't get into a big statistical discussion of what standard deviation means, but essentially this tells us that what we're interested in is we're interested in street segments that experienced 6 or more robberies, right? So in this exercise, we're going to consider any street segment that had 6 or more robberies as our hotspots, right? Because that's above the 1 standard deviation mark. So that means we're really getting past what the average level of crime is. Now, what that enables us to do, the orange is a little tough to see. I should have picked a better color choice. But what that enables us to do is now to classify our individual street segments, which are real areas, right? So we could say Main Street between Central and Broad. That's a real place, right? So what that lets us do is classify streets according to how much crime they have, right? So the red color streets, those are the streets in Rochester that have gun robbery levels 3 standard deviations above the mean. So if you're looking for target areas, those are probably the places you go first. The orange areas, those are areas that have gun robbery counts between 2 and 3 standard deviations above the mean. If you have enough resources to target more areas, those are the second places you should go. And again, just using basic math and using the new chart functionality, you could just categorize that however you want, right, based upon how many individual target areas you need to target. All right, so before I wrap up, I wanted to remind you that, right, so this was a very quick tour of the hotspot functionality of ArcGIS Pro. Wanted to point out that there's a lot of other tools at your disposal, right? And for those of you who have the software, who have access to the software now, in addition to the hotspots tool, I'd recommend you kind of poking around. Some of this other stuff is very helpful. You're going to love the percent. So anyone who works for an agency that does ComStat, you're going to love the percent change tool. Right? So this whole, what was crime this year versus last year across all of our precincts, you can now do that in the click of a button, and it calculates the percentage for you. Again, the 80-20 analysis, the space-time analysis, there's not a lot of really cool stuff within this portion of the toolbox. With that said, that's all I have. All right, not too early. They need 2 minutes time. So if there's any questions about anything, I'm happy to take them. Yes. I think I slightly disagree with you. I think this makes Corey's point. Right? If this was a purely scientific exercise, there'd be one way to do it, right? And that one way would be, we can measure that one way was the best way to do it, right? Using raster mapping or to optimize hotspots or joining the street segments, right? Like those are all different techniques that you could cater, right, to depending on what you need, right? So I think, yeah, so I kind of think Corey and I are making the same general point through the 2 different presentations. All right, thank you.
I just want to briefly say very quickly before we all head out to lunch, I really want to thank Eric, who has been touring the state with me, doing the trainings for the past year. And for those of you, just want to kind of let you know that we will be continuing that tour through 2020. Eric has graciously agreed to do a number of trainings throughout the state in Arc Pro for this year. I know we've done a standard training. I don't want to call the next one advanced training because I want to call it more of a continuation of the training. Yeah. Well, because we're going to go higher than that at some point. So we're going to do more of those trainings this year. So for those of you who get my emails, you will be seeing those trainings come out. They will be on our calendar. And anybody else who is interested in the trainings and you don't get my emails, just feel free to reach out. Again, I just want to thank Eric, who's been a great partner for this past year, and looking forward to more of his trainings this year. All right. So with that said, thank you guys for coming. See you at lunch.
We should get a t-shirt.